name's Jennifer Rubiello. I'm the State Director for Environment Florida. I'm really honored to be here. We are a statewide citizen-funded environmental advocacy group that works to protect Florida's air, water, and open spaces by investigating problems, crafting solutions, and educating the public to help make sure that people have the tools they need to make their voices heard in local, state, and national debates over the quality of our air and our environment and our water in our lives. Now, I'm here this morning to talk about fracking. Laura went over the broad impacts our energy choices have on Everglades restoration. I am going to attempt to take a brief but deeper dive into the impacts that fracking has on our air, water, and open spaces like the Everglades, recap briefly what's happened in Florida when it comes to fracking, and then talk about what's next in the fight to stop fracking in the Sunshine State. Now, before I get into all that though, I've heard several people throughout this conference talk about getting the Florida bug, so I thought I'd share how I got here. I first moved to Florida, to West Palm Beach, about 5 years ago from Berkeley, California. I landed in the middle of a tropical storm, and I remember thinking to myself that if the plane didn't crash, that I'd probably get eaten by an alligator or attacked by mosquitoes, and that was before I knew that there were pythons here. So, but I did grow up hiking and swimming in the ocean, and diligently reading every Save the Manatee Club newsletter since as long as I can remember. So it didn't take me long to completely fall in love with this state and all the beautiful, extraordinary landscapes and ecosystems and people that it's home to. So I say all that because I really believe that living in Florida is a privilege. And as many have echoed throughout the conference, we as Floridians have a responsibility and really an obligation to boldly protect our resources and our environment for future generations. So, what is fracking? Fracking is a highly polluting and destructive industrial process that shoots water, sand, and a toxic tide of chemicals underground to get at the oil and gas that's trapped beneath the Earth's surface. Now, when I say this, I use a definition that includes the impacts resulting from all of the activities needed to bring a gas or oil well into production, so the whole process. The oil and gas industry tends to use a more restrictive definition of fracking that includes only the actual moment in the extraction process when the rock is fractured. And that's a definition that really masks some of fracking's most harmful impacts. Now, in Florida, it's also important to note that there are a couple different types of techniques that involve using chemicals to stimulate more oil and gas production. Our friends at the Conservancy have put this slide together, which has always been very helpful. So that's acidizing, acid fracturing. Acidizing uses chemicals to dissolve rock. And acid fracturing uses acid to fracture the rock. And in both cases, the chemicals pose a threat to our environment and our health. It's the bad news. Fracking itself, as Laura mentioned, is water intensive. Right now, Florida doesn't have enough water to meet our future demand in most of the state. A demand which is expected, I think, to increase by at least 20% according to the DEP. And so meeting this demand would result in unacceptable environmental impacts like saltwater intrusion and loss of wetlands and much more. Yet fracking requires huge amounts and volumes of water for each well, water that's often needed for other uses to maintain healthy aquatic ecosystems, for instance. Nationwide, a recent Fracking by the Numbers report that we released last year, at least 239 billion gallons of water have been used for fracking. That's about 3 since 2005, so that's about 3 million gallons per well. And then on top of that, water used in fracking becomes unsuitable for most other uses, so it's permanently taken out of the water cycle. Now, case in point here in Florida, sure, you've heard of this before, but in 2013, Texas-based Hannah Hughes Oil Company illegally acidized and later hydraulically fracked at the Hogan Well in the Sunland Trend. in the Western Everglades. And I think the important thing to note here is that if it hadn't been stopped, it would have been permanent to use 280 million gallons of water per year for one well, which is insane. Now, fracking not only threatens water quantity, but water quality. Last month, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, in a final report, did in fact find that, guess what, fracking can contaminate drinking water. Across the country, really? I know, took this long. Fracking wastewater has leaked into retention ponds, it's escaped from faulty disposal wells, putting all of our drinking water at risk. Now, wastewater from fracked wells includes over 300 toxic chemicals. We don't want any of that in our porous limestone geology anywhere near our aquifer. It includes carcinogens like benzene, and certainly the other issue with it is it can bring naturally occurring radioactive materials back up to the surface. Now, in Pennsylvania, a state that's plagued by fracking, regulators, for example, have confirmed 260 instances of private well contamination from fracking operations since 2005. It's probably a severe underestimate. And then more data, also from Pennsylvania, from 2010 to 2012, shows that a 6 to 7% rate of well failure. 6 to 7% rate of well failure.
It was there.
Yeah, there we go. All right. So anyways, I say all that, thank you, Marty, within the broad frame that fracking does not only affect water quantity, water quality, but it affects climate change as well. So we ultimately know that there'll be a whole panel on climate change and the impacts on Everglades restoration later. But we already know that methane from fracking wells adds global warming pollution to the atmosphere. Now, methane is a global warming pollutant that's 86 to 105 times more powerful than carbon dioxide over the course of a 20-year span. And it's released at multiple stages in the fracking process, including during hydraulic fracturing and well completion, and then in the processing and transport of gas to end users. So it's a fun little GIF that quantifies some of that, but natural gas leaks in 2014, to exemplify the magnitude, had the global warming equivalent of 251 coal-fired power plants. So if all of that weren't enough, fracking also destroys natural landscapes. Since 2005, infrastructure to support fracking has directly damaged over at least 679,000 acres of land, an area that's nearly the size of Big Cypress Preserve. So Laura also touched on this, but as well paths, roads, pipelines, and other gas infrastructure replace forest, wetlands, and farmland, we use precious areas that we need for our wildlife and ecosystems. Now, Laura also mentioned this, but we, as we speak, Burnett Oil Company is on the brink of moving forward with seismic testing on 70,000 acres of the Big Cypress Preserve, and it's only the first step of a 4-phase project that has already been approved. Another seismic testing attempt right above Big Cypress by Tocala would cause seismic testing on over 100,000 acres of land right above the Big Cypress Preserve. Now, the reason that's really bad is, we're using equipment that ultimately sends explosives 50 to 200 feet down into the ground and creates vibrations from the trucks to then conduct the testing, which we know is bad for wildlife and for our ecosystems. So, I think it's also worth noting, so the piece here, that we rely on energy from all across the state. We use a lot of energy, and we tend to get it from other places, and it has to be transported here. So right now, Spectra Energy, which recently got bought out by Enbridge, owners of the Dakota Access Pipeline, are are building a fracked gas pipeline and compressor stations throughout the state, this whole network, which is going to wed us to natural gas for the next 50 years, when we actually should be building renewable energy infrastructure. Right? It's happening right now. I think it's madness, quite frankly. Jim is going to talk about the alternatives in much more depth and detail, but I do want to echo that we do have the alternatives. America has massive, virtually inexhaustible renewable energy resources, both from the wind, the sun, and earth, and just a fraction of these resources can power entire societies. So this image on the right, the US has the technical potential to meet its current electricity needs more than 100 times over with solar and 10 times over with wind. And we don't have, technology's not the problem, economic barriers aren't the problem at this point. There's at least 7 detailed studies of clean energy systems conducted by academics, government agencies, and nonprofit organizations that suggest that we have the tools we need to make a transition. We have them. And it's already starting to happen. So my hometown of St. Pete, where I live now, just committed to going 100% renewables. Big shout out to the Sierra Club there and lots of others. Las Vegas, Georgetown, Texas, all just a few cities across the country that are making the right decision. I'll wrap up and say that the good news is in the last few years we've come a very long way in the fight against fracking. For one thing, a decade ago, many of the facts around fracking were disputed. In 2008, this was mentioned at the Florida Fracking Summit, only 6 peer-reviewed papers on fracking's health and environmental impacts were out there. Now there's over 900. And then here in Florida, over 80 cities and counties, I think we're at 86 now, have passed resolutions or ordinances opposing fracking. But it didn't magically happen. I mean, I remember people thinking I was crazy when I would say that fracking could happen in Florida 3 years ago. Just like Everglades restoration, really any other big fight, solar, etc. The fight to stop fracking has been a sustained group effort. As an anti-fracking community, we successfully defeated a bill for the last 3 years that would have allowed 1, fracking operations to really expand in Florida, 2, fracking chemicals to be kept a secret from the general public, and then 3, local communities to be prohibited from enacting protections to keep fracking out. Now, without the Conservancy's science advocacy, the Center for Biological Diversity's legal expertise, and the Sierra Club, Stone Crab Alliance, and Floridians Against Fracking Coalition sustained organizing and advocacy, and most recently, Florida Conservation Voters' electoral work to help make fracking an election issue, we wouldn't be so positioned going into this legislative session. So what to expect for this year? Floridians don't want fracking, and our state legislators are finally starting to pay attention, thank goodness. We're likely to see a permanent ban bill introduced, and then a permanent ban bill with a study that's likely going to be bipartisan. Maybe, likely no bad regulatory bills, but you never know. So, and I'll go ahead and wrap up with that. So, fracking is water intensive, threatens our water quality, fuels climate change, destroys natural landscapes, all bad things, all totally incompatible with Everglades restoration. It cannot be regulated safely, period, and so it must be banned. And so I hope, as Laura mentioned at the end of her presentation, that y'all will get involved, really work to build the connections between Everglades restoration's energy and water impacts. Here's some great resources that I personally find really helpful in my work. And then if you haven't written to your state senator or representative, which I know everyone here knows how to do, please do and ask them to ban fracking. And then certainly on March 22nd, would love if everybody here can make it to Reclaiming Florida's Future for All, a big advocacy day in Tallahassee that a whole bunch of groups are putting together to really push this forward and make sure we have a ban in 2017. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer.